LAWsome listeners. Matt Smyers and I just came off of a conversation with Amanda Lee. She is the founder and the CEO of The Lee Consultants, and she's hitting on a topic that unfortunately is really buried commonly. It's around domestic abuse, especially the professional responsibility aspect. This is a conversation specifically for victims, but also for leaders who may not be aware of this type of environment that's going on in their team members' homes, their livelihoods. And so this is something that impacts business, no question, impacts personal lives, productivity, and literally everything in between. She has an incredible message and a mission that she's pursuing. You're in for a treat with this discussion, but it's also something that it's going to open your eyes up to what's out there and the importance of awareness when it comes to such a sensitive topic. Matt, what was your take from the call?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's safe for me to say that since I've been involved in the show, this is the single most important topic that we've discussed, and it has nothing to do with the practice or business of law. I think what Amanda is doing is amazing. And anything that we can do to help her and help raise awareness around this topic, if we can reach one person through this that is in need of help, who's willing to come forward and seek the help that they need, then we'll be very happy with that result. But I think generally just getting people to be more aware of the topic and how it affects professionals specifically, whether it's legal or otherwise. So Amanda really dives into that topic, and I think does a great job explaining how there are unique challenges there. And so, listeners are really in for something special here with Amanda and hearing what she has to say.
So all that said, we hope you enjoy. And if you haven't yet, we encourage you to subscribe. We're committed to continuously bringing some of these thought leaders within the legal community in marketing, management, and everything in between. Enjoy this talk with Amanda. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's LAWsome episode. I'm your host, Tanner Jones, along with my co-host, Matt Smyers. We're kicking off this episode with Amanda Lee, founder and CEO of The Lee Consultants. Today's topic, it's domestic abuse and professional responsibility, a leadership conversation. We're excited about this discussion. Amanda, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Well, so it's always useful to kick off around the history, and the backstory. So for anyone who may not be familiar with you or specifically The Lee Consultants, what led you to where you are today?
So most people probably aren't familiar with it because I did just kick this off a couple months ago publicly. So I'm really excited to be here to talk about it. I think to understand what I do with the Lee Consultants, or TLC for short, is to really understand who I am and where I came from. So I've been a trial attorney for 20 years now. I started in prosecution. I specialized in sex crimes and child abuse. I then went to city schools, Baltimore City Public Schools, one of the largest school systems in the nation. I did all of their litigation. I was in-house counsel for them. And in 2020, I went to the federal government, and I'm now an attorney in the intelligence community. So that's my background, my resume. While I was doing all of that, I did a lot with nonprofits and different organizations. I was appointed to the Maryland Commission for Women. So I've always done a lot in the field of advocacy for women and children. But there's another part of that was not known until recently, and that's that during the first decade, actually more than a decade, of building my career, I was a victim of domestic violence. I was hiding it from everyone as I was building this career, as I was moving up in the ranks, as I was being successful as a trial attorney and just building what I had and getting to where I was. And so finally, when I got out of that situation and I became more comfortable with talking about it, I realized that I wasn't alone and that there was this really big gap, not only in knowledge, but also in resources for people like me. And after just thinking about it over and over and talking to different people who were in this situation like I was, but also never talked about it, I realized we need to do something about this, not only in our profession, but just in the professional world. So that's when I created TLC, because what it really is, it's a place where I'm providing services for high achieving professionals who are victims of domestic violence. I provide this corporate piece where I do trainings and help change this culture so it is something that's talked about. And then I also help those individuals escape what they're in, and doing that in a way that they can continue to thrive professionally. They can have as least amount of distractions as possible, in their life while trying to escape. So that's what I'm doing now. I will not be practicing law with TLC. I am still with the feds practicing, but there will be no, legal practice with the consulting business.
That's amazing. And Amanda, thank you for being here, and thank you for all you're doing to bring this issue to the forefront. Incredibly brave and just amazing work you're doing. Keeping this within the context of our target audience, right, which is the legal profession. And you touched on this a little bit in your opening. Why is domestic abuse particularly difficult to recognize within high-performing professions and executive environments like the legal profession?
Well, this answer is twofold, because there's really two major reasons. One is because domestic violence is misunderstood. So the fact that people don't understand it, they don't know what to look for, and they also don't think that it happens amongst our ranks. It's not something that people talk about. So they don't know about it, and they don't know what to look for. But that also then creates this stigma for people who are experiencing it. So they work even harder to keep this a secret. So now we have this area where people don't know what to look for. They don't think it happens. And those that it's happening to are staying silent. That then makes it very difficult to recognize. And then we also have the fact that, our legal profession is very demanding. There's a lot of characteristics that victims will use because it's what they have to do to survive that actually are, commended in the legal field. People are, very used to being working under stress. They're used to being detail oriented, being proactive, and all of these things that often survivors have to do to survive, and it benefits them in their legal career. So people just see it as them being this hypervigilant attorney and don't even realize that it's also something that they're doing in their personal life.
When we decided to have this conversation and have you on, one of my objectives coming in was I want to make sure that I'm leaving our listeners with some very practical advice. We're talking to two different audiences, right? We're talking to professionals who are not victims, of abuse, and then we're talking to professionals who may be. And you touched on what to look for. And I think that's speaking to people that may be in contact with or working with victims and not know it. Can we dive into that a little bit in more detail and talk about what are some things to look for and how we can help others who, maybe, our colleagues who might be victims of abuse and we don't know it?
Yeah. And that's a great question. And, I don't even think that the best answer is to give you signs to look for, because it's going to be very different. Again, and I say we because I am a survivor. I'm someone who did this. I worked so hard to keep those signs not available to anyone I worked with. I mean, the people that I told that were closest to me when I was working, and I finally disclosed to them later, their immediate reaction was just pure shock. And this was people that I worked very closely with. They were blown away. And so even if they knew the quote unquote typical signs of domestic violence and abuse, I was being very, very intentional about hiding those. So really what I think the best advice is to just start challenging the narrative that's out there and start being willing to accept that this happens. Because really what victims need is they need to know that they're believed and that they're supported. And most importantly, that this struggle, whether it be domestic violence or any type of struggle we have, is not going to diminish their professional success. Because that's really what the problem is here, is a lot of people in this situation, we've worked so hard to build this career, to get to where we are. We are respected. We have all of this. And we're so afraid of, well, what's going to happen if people find this out and then think I'm weak? They're going to question my competency, my emotional stability, all of these different things. So I don't necessarily think it's about looking out for signs. It's more about being proactive and accepting that this is part of life and this happens amongst our ranks, and being there to be supportive and offer resources for people.
Yeah, that's important. And I know there are a lot of frankly, misconceptions out there, but a lot of it potentially is just leaders, burying their head in the sand potentially. But I'd love to hear from you why you believe society still associates domestic violence with maybe only certain demographics, and how does that belief silence some of the high achieving victims that are out there today?
Yeah, well, I think it's because that's what this picture is that society has painted. So whether it be, TV shows and whatever media you consume, you often see this victim as a stereotypical victim. You see this, they're uneducated, they're low income, they're not somebody who is thriving in a professional field. And so that's this narrative that's out there. That's what's painted, on the screens. Hollywood actually had a chance with that movie. It Ends With Us. It was kind of recent, and they blew it. That movie was awful. It did not depict domestic violence as they had the opportunity to do. So, we've got that already, just what we consume, and how important that is, what we consume, we start believing. But then we also have this idea with the resources that are out there. And the nonprofits, as wonderful as they are, there's a gap in what they provide. When you think of resources for victims, you think of shelters. Well, people at this demographic, that's not normally what they need. I mean, I was the breadwinner. I owned my house. I didn't need a shelter. And a lot of the victims and survivors I've spoken to, they say that's not what I needed. Some of them even went to these nonprofits and they were turned away because either they made too much money or they just couldn't provide for what they needed. So because of all of that, it just really feeds into this narrative of this is not what a victim looks like. It looks like someone who is, a different kind of demographic, the people who are the secretaries, the stay-at-home moms, the waitresses. And so that's what people start to believe. And when that's what the belief is, it makes a person who's experiencing it silenced. It makes them feel isolated, embarrassed, shamed. And so they just are really encouraged to stay silent.
How do we get from awareness to real change within an organization? And how do you help organizations get there?
Yeah, I think the first thing is just being willing to acknowledge this, So just saying, okay, I'm going to learn about this is huge. And that is where that awareness piece comes in, saying, okay, I want to become aware. I want to be educated. Because even just understanding the nuances of domestic violence is really important. So that's great. But then making that change, like you said, is what we really need. And that's where it's taking these proactive steps. It's going beyond just taking in the knowledge, but actually vocalizing acceptance of it, vocalizing the acknowledgement. And that can come not only by doing trainings, that's one thing that I do. I go into corporations, and whether it be a business or just a conference or some type of retreat, and I talk about it. I talk about what it is. And putting that out there is one way to start changing it, because it's saying, okay, yep, we're recognizing it here. But then there's also things like policies, making sure that there are policies for flexibility, making sure that it's known that if someone has a safety concern, they can alert their colleagues or whoever they need to do that. It's, talking about it in newsletters and emails. It's all of those things to just show that, hey, we know this happens, and therefore you can be supported. And then also resources. That's a whole nother step that we can also provide as well, which I can help with, and I can also speak on if you'd like.
Amanda, the terms domestic violence and domestic abuse are commonly used interchangeably. And I'd be curious to hear, just given your experience and this mission that you're on in life, how do you see the two terms differing, or do you see them being very similar?
They really are interchangeable. And what it is that domestic violence was the first term that was used. When this really became something that people talked about, a lot of talk was about battered women's syndrome. It was all about violence, physical violence against women. So this term was coined, domestic violence. But over time, people began to speak about, and there was research done, and psychologists got out there saying, well, it's more than just physical violence. There is all of these other types of abuse that are out there. And that just began to be considered part of domestic violence. So it's kind of morphed over time, because the word domestic, or the phrase domestic abuse, really makes more sense, because it is, the word violence kind of normally means physical violence. That's what people think of. So they really mean the same thing, and they've just morphed over time. I think the phrase domestic abuse is really more, is really more appropriate and accurate, but I use both of them just because domestic violence or DV is just so commonly used and spoken of. So they really are interchangeable.
How can professionals speak to somebody they suspect might be experiencing abuse without overstepping or potentially causing more harm?
Yeah, I think that's a great thing for people to start thinking about. What do I do? And obviously, I say the first step is to just have this dialogue anyway. This should be something that we can talk about. And I think it was actually really important that you noted that this is something that's, this has never been on your podcast. Because honestly, I don't think it's really ever been on any podcast. This is something that is really new. I mean, I've written some articles that have been out there, the ABA, the Maryland State Bar, they've all, published articles that I've written, and I've gotten so much feedback, like I've never heard something like this before. And so I say all that to say, just having this, out there is really important to start this conversation. And so when you do want to start acknowledging it, what if you do see somebody that you think is experiencing this? Hopefully you've already set that stage where you can comfortably talk to them. But if not, or even if it is and you're still a little nervous, what I would say is, first off, make sure you're in a safe place. You don't make sure it's private. You want to make sure the person is, not under some stress of a deadline or something. Make it a little bit informal if you can. Do not ask questions as far as, seeking details. Really just relay concern, support, and resources. It's okay to say, hey, I was a little bit concerned when, I saw something happen, or you seemed a little distracted. I just want to make sure you have what you need and you're okay. Say, here's some resources that you might benefit from, and then leave it up to them. Because I will tell you that in this position, especially a high achieving professional, someone who is working so hard to keep this a secret, the last thing they want to do is be felt like they're trapped in a corner where they have to admit what they're going through. I didn't use the word victim or survivor on myself until years after leaving. So if someone asked me, are you a victim? I would have been defensive. My wall would have went up and I would have been like, no, give me a new assignment. Let me get out of here. But if it's just I'm concerned, here's some resources that you might benefit from, and then leave it. Let them then know, hey, this is a safe place. If I want to come to you, I can. But you're also giving them that opportunity to see some resources and maybe ask some questions, or maybe they will want to disclose. And if someone does disclose, the most important thing to do is listen without judgment. Tell them you believe them, tell them it's not their fault, and just listen.
You've mentioned resources throughout, and we want to be very intentional about mentioning those and also linking them here. Can you give us a handful of places for people to start?
Well, and that's one of the things that I at TLC really am providing. That's because, again, like I said, this gap in resources. Obviously, there are those wonderful places that everyone knows about, the domestic violence hotline, there's the local shelters, there's all of these different resources out there like that. But again, a lot of people won't go to them. So what I do is I have a very intentional program that is designed to help this demographic, where we do strategic safety planning that takes into consideration their lifestyle, the demands on their career, and all of that. So I do direct individual coaching with people to get out of that. And I also, this is where my corporate and individual services overlap. I offer this to corporations to put as part of their employee benefits package. We all have, or most places have, some type of employee, EAP type of service, but those do not meet the needs of a person who is trying to leave an abusive relationship. And honestly, I've spoken to a lot of attorneys who have said they're wonderful, but I wouldn't have used those. I'm this high-level executive. I actually had one person who was in-house counsel at a very large pharmaceutical company, and she said, I was experiencing this, but my client was HR, and they were coming. I was the one advising them how to do these programs, what to do. She's like, there's no way I would have ever went and used that service. So having something like me, who is this outsider, who is this very specialized, nuanced service for your leaders, your professionals, that they can come to and know that it is very specific, it is very direct for this issue, would just be key. It would be really, really beneficial. And again, it's not really out there. Right now, professionals are just kind of left on their own to figure out, how do I leave while I'm still, meeting all of the needs of my career and my children and my life and all of that. So I really do. I'm really excited to be able to offer this resource to people.
Amanda, we're so grateful for the work that you're doing, this mission, and for your willingness to shine a light on a topic that truly needs a light shown on it. So we're grateful for that. Thank you for spending some time with us here at the LAWsome podcast. We'd ask, are there any questions that you would have liked for us to ask you that we missed?
I think you hit all of that. Yeah, this was really great. I really appreciate it.
What's the best way for our listeners to find you?
They can find me on my website or on LinkedIn. I think it's theleeconsultants.com. My LinkedIn page is Amanda Lee. I do have, my LinkedIn page also has my last name, Costley, is what I do still use in the legal profession, but Amanda Lee is what I use here. So you will see Amanda Lee Costley on LinkedIn.
Well, thanks again for the time.
Thank you. Thank you so much.